The first question I ask is to President Kagame. Sir, the MDGs, have we really made progress?
Yes, thank you. MDGs made really good progress, but it's winding up and transitioning to sustainable development goals when there is still a lot of work to do. Obviously, the problem was huge. Looking at globally, the indicators show people are still struggling across the world, and there is a lot of work to do, but much has been done through MDGs. A lot of experiences have been shared, a lot of examples that have worked and places where they have worked have been taken on board. So I think there is good progress if you look at across the globe.
But if we take the change, it seems very incremental. But how do we have systemic change?
Systemic change would come about by learning lessons of what has been achieved and what has not been achieved and why. So primarily it is through continued investments. It is through ensuring that really there is ownership of solutions and these processes by the people on the ground, or whether citizens or systems of government, different levels of government, understanding that this is their problem and they therefore have to look for all evidence and on basis of that policies be formulated to try and bring about solutions and focus on getting the results, having things done. I think that would create a systemic improvement rather than just adding a little. It can't be business as usual. I think we've really got to learn lessons where things work, how they have worked, why or why the things have not worked, and adjust accordingly and put ownership in the hands of the very people who are suffering, because they also have to be participants as well as working with the leaders on the ground.
I mean, given the Rwandan story, we see a lot of, in the West where I live, we read a lot of media about the progress that your leadership has actually resulted in. Can you tell us a little bit about how the MDGs have fared in Rwanda?
Well, I'll tell you how they have worked. I think that is the more interesting part of the story. We have seen improvements in education, both access and covering. If you look at, say, basic primary education, where the enrollment rate is at 97%, that is huge. So much as we have had access and scaling up on this access, we have now started focusing on quality so that we don't just have access without quality. Things have worked. If you look at health indicators, under 5 mortality or mother's health and prevention of death for the mothers has made huge progress, very significant globally. In fact, the change that has taken place in the recent times is probably at the fastest rate anywhere in the world. If you look at how we have obtained food security for our citizens, the gains through governance, and how the improvement has come about and come about very fast. I would really be happy to talk more about successes rather than failures. Much as we are not where we want to be, we want to do more, we want even to do better. But I think what has been achieved inspires us to do more and move faster. So the private sector is growing, is developing, is gaining capacity and playing a bigger role and eventually leading the growth of our economy and development. So I think there are good reasons to talk about successes instead of failures.
Great, thank you. Mr. Blair, you were Prime Minister for a very long time in the UK. I don't mean that in any other way.
You made that sound as if it was too long, but which possibly was. Whoops.
Sorry.
There you are.
As a card-carrying member of the Labour Party, we were proud of your achievement.
Thank you.
Mr. Blair, when you think about your experience in government, and you were there at the heart of it, in trying to shape the G agenda in particular, what advice would you give to current leadership, political leadership in the world, on the next 15 years?
I think when we were having the G8 summit in 2005 at Gleneagles, and we put Africa on the agenda, which was quite an innovation at the time, and we agreed a lot of things that had a financial implication around debt relief, increased aid, and so on. And we actually trebled the aid budget in the UK. The USA actually trebled its aid budget. And by and large, that had a significant impact. So some countries were able to use the money saved from debt cancellation to invest, for example, in education. I think the next 15 years, it's got to be, and we did say this at the time, by the way, in 2005, but I think even more so today, it's got to be about a partnership between developed and developing world, less a kind of donor-recipient relationship, more a partnership relationship.
When you talk about this change, the big white elephant in the room is about education finance. Today we talk about a gap of $22 billion, and the SDG agenda, as I understand it, is going to cost us hundreds of billions of dollars. How do we address this particular problem?
With difficulty, really, because especially right now with people's budgets. But
do you not think that it's lip service?
Well, I think, look, you definitely need the money. But here's the thing, and I learned this from dealing with an education budget in a developed world country. You can have two schools with the same budget, and one is educating the children really well, and the other isn't. So I agree money is really important, right? Without money, without, for example, infrastructure, and therefore access to technology through electricity, it's very hard to educate people. Without paying teachers properly, without school buildings, money matters. Don't misunderstand me. It matters fundamentally. But it isn't only about the money. And I think it's a lot easier today to get donors to invest in education programs if those programs are also ones in which the money is being used wisely and sensibly, and we are learning the lessons of the developing world around the issue of education. And what are those lessons? They're around the quality of teachers, the ability to actually understand what's happening in your education system, because many countries, the kids are in the school, but there's no assessment of what is really being taught and what they're learning. Access to technology is absolutely critical, and leadership. Leadership in government's important, leadership in a school's important. So how are you growing that cadre of leaders? And, what is the right mix of provision? Because sometimes you will get good low-cost education providers as well that may be a new type of education in a country's education system. This also is important, I think. You need to experiment with different providers, different ways of doing education. So my view about this is that money is obviously very important because it's preconditional to success, but it isn't the only thing. And I think there is a very clear lesson, in my view, from education around the world, which is that money is only half the answer. The other half is what does the money go towards, and what is the quality, both of the teachers and what is being taught in the classroom.
President Kagame, you spoke about a balance in the relationship, at least I'm paraphrasing, sir, between all the stakeholders involved in this discussion. So governmental, non-governmental, and I also want to bring in the private sector to this. What do you think the appropriate balance is?
Between the private sector and, well, I think we are going to get results by involving stakeholders, but also through partnerships. I completely agree with the Honorable Blair when he talks about money, first of all, money is very necessary, but it's not the only problem. Sometimes it is not even the main problem, because you find a lot of problems that need money still prevalent in places where there is a lot of money. So it is how you bring money to work, or how innovatively you link the problem with the spending required, with the financing. So the balance will be brought about by fully understanding that it's not one party that is going to entirely find a solution, but rather different stakeholders playing their part. So public and private have a stake in this, because when you are talking about education, we are talking about skills. We are talking about the balance between job seekers and the job creators. We are talking about employment. So how do we leave out anybody and think we are going to address this particular problem? So the balance is really basically on understanding the problem, and therefore involving the stakeholders in different measures proportionate to how much they can contribute.
Thank you. Mr. Blair, in your premiership, you actually introduced a form of public-private partnership in education. I mean, in your lessons of reform, what do you think worked in that case?
I think today what works is crossing boundaries between public, private, and voluntary sectors. And I think, you know, conversation I often have with the presidents, prime ministers I work with around the world is they sometimes say to me, well, when are we going to get an education system or a healthcare system like yours? And I say, don't ask yourself that question. Ask yourself, with the benefit of the analysis of the weaknesses of the legacy of our systems, how would you today innovate so that you avoid some of those problems as well as access some of the good parts of our systems? So I personally think one of the problems of our system, in the Western system, is when it is very monolithic, very bureaucratic, when, as it were, you know, we just take a decided view of, right, this is how the school's going to be organized, this is how it's going to be run. When, you know, for example, in the academy system, we made big changes in the UK. We had a public-private partnership. There are voluntary groups that can also play a major part in education. And I'm a great believer in, see, the thing with government is, and, you know, it's a funny thing is, because when you begin in government, you have this very naive view. And I had this view, right? Because I was sitting in Downing Street, in number 10 Downing Street. It was a very historic place. And you sit around the cabinet table, and all the chairs of the table have no arms apart from the Prime Minister's chair. His are the arms to it, right? So you kind of get the idea, you're the important guy in this room. And I had this naive view that if I sat there and I said something should happen, that actually something would happen.
Heaven forbid.
And after a time, I learned this isn't how it works at all. The system and government is brilliant at managing the status quo. Where government's weak is in changing the status quo. And sometimes, therefore, if you have a kind of monolithic system in which everything is uniform and done the same way, you get nothing of what I call the disruptive element that is often the most important element of providing change. And that's why I think if I was, you know, running an education system in a developing country today, I would be also experimenting with public-private partnerships, different forms of provision, certainly the use of technology, which I think is literally revolutionary, if you are able to access technology. Some countries aren't. That's why electricity is such an important thing for a country today. And I would be looking at marching across those boundaries of public, private, and voluntary. So, and there's no harm in experimentation either in government. I mean, experiments in government always terrify people, but really, in every other walk of life, you will try things. I think it's also important to do that as well. And one of the reasons why I think this conference is important, and the work that Sunny and all you guys have done is very interesting, is that actually there will be examples in this room of things that have really worked. Right? But often you don't know of those examples. You're sitting in your own department, in your own country, and all you know is your own system. But someone somewhere, I promise you, is wrestling with exactly the same problem and is finding a solution. So go and talk to them, is my general view.
Mr. Blair, it wouldn't have escaped you that there's a general election in the offing in our country, in the UK.
Right.
Forgive me for asking this question.
I won't. or at least forgive me for not answering it if it's, if it's anything remotely undiplomatic.
There's this big question that we get asked, especially when we look at access to education, in that we require a lot more teachers, we require a lot more trained teachers that national systems perhaps can't cope with, is a suggestion that's been made. Would you support untrained teachers in classrooms?
Depends what you're asking people to do in a classroom. I mean, look, here's what I think. I think teaching is the same as anything else in this respect. That if you can imagine any professional walk of life, probably as a result of what's happened in the last 20 years, you are doing things differently today than you did it 20 years ago. Right? There's no reason why teaching should be any different. So I'm not sufficiently expert to say what someone should do or shouldn't do in the classroom, but I am sufficiently intuitive to think what you're doing in the classroom today is probably not the same as 20 years ago. And also, and I stress because many people here will be from countries where electricity is not available in all schools by any means, or maybe even in a majority of schools. But where you have access to technology today, technology alone should change the way you teach. So I don't know what people mean when they say untrained teachers in the classroom, but I think the concept of how we teach surely should undergo some process of change and adjustment, given the way the rest of the world has changed. But you're still going to need certain things in teaching will never change. We all remember the teachers that made a big impact on us. What made a big impact was their commitment, their enthusiasm, the sense that they really wanted to help you, all of those things. I think those are the basic character things that will never change. But how we teach, yeah, probably that should change.
Thank you, sir. President Kagame, you are known, apart from being an incredible leader in government, as someone who's a technology enthusiast. And recently I read about the partnership that you've struck with Facebook and edX. What role of technology do you see in education systems, given your own example?
Well, it's huge, but let me start with, again, something Honorable Blair has just mentioned. In certain places like ours, if we compare with the status quo in the UK, ours is such that you can't be spoiled by the status quo. You have to change it. Sure. You just can't put up with the status quo. There is pressure to make sure that we change it. So we learn lessons from our problems as well as from the best practices elsewhere and forge partnership alongside that. Now, back to the question. Technology is going to be very crucial almost in every aspect of life, and starting with education. In the vision we have for our country, we have Vision 2020. We are looking at building a knowledge-based economy, and therefore building skills and education and so on and so forth. But we found that technology is right at the center of the two. At every level, even in providing education or basing it on it to acquire skills and therefore using that not only to enhance skills and learning and so on and so forth, but as a business in itself. So that's how we have come to forge partnerships with the different technology companies, including the two you have just mentioned. And for example, we are doing it at 2 or 3 levels. One is to make sure that we provide technology as a tool for education right from primary schools. In fact, we have a program ongoing where the ambition is to give each child in a primary school a laptop. We have a project called 1 laptop per child. But this already starts education on matters of technology with the children right from a very young age. But in the process, it provides a platform where they access a lot of materials that you wouldn't be able to access in classrooms. So wherever they are, because they are not always in the classrooms, they can still access a lot of materials from wherever they are. And there we have also had to invest, therefore, not only in energy, but also in IT industry as a whole and telecom. Like now we have 4G LTE operating. We have invested heavily in broadband to make sure that schools, administrative centers, hospitals, and others have access to broadband to make easy and enhance the work they are involved in. So technology in education is absolutely essential, but it has to be afforded. So that's where these partnerships are very important, because they have the kind of capacity in terms of financing, expertise, and that is lacking in situations like ours in Rwanda or other developing countries.
President Kagame, we hear a lot and we read a lot about youth unemployment in Africa in particular. You know, how do education systems cater to that issue that exists?
Now, I'll share with you a small example, a little example about our own situation. You see, from the beginning, there was emphasis, even between us and our development partners, on investing in primary education. It took a long time before they started seeing that you don't stop at primary, you even have to go to secondary education. Later on, of course, we would even challenge our partners and say, look, developed countries are not developed by primary school graduates. Certainly, these are people who had higher education. So we therefore had to make sure that we continue to invest in these in technologies and shift from just primary and secondary and even tertiary education. In between, we introduced technical and vocational education programs so that people acquire skills. You know, the skills through technical and vocational training programs, rather than just reading at the primary level or secondary level, or even go to university, and by the time you graduate, there is little you can do with that kind of education. So we have introduced in the middle these technical and vocational programs. And I think they are aimed at exactly filling that gap of unemployment. Now we are seeing a more educated young men or trained in skills they can put on the market anytime, even before they attend tertiary education. It's one way of doing that. And as I said again, investing in technology at early stages, young people really develop entrepreneurial minds right from the early stage. And therefore, technology supports the capacity and quest for innovations. All these are filling gaps of unemployment, as we have seen it practically in our own situation. I think if it works in our place, it works better even in other places.
Absolutely. Mr. Blair, in terms of your role in the Middle East in particular, you know, the question about the demographic time bomb or youth unemployment gap and all these conversations happen. We have a lot of very delicate situations in this neighborhood. I mean, what do you think education systems need to do to factor in skills training?
Well, I think there are two very important things about education in this region. I've just come from the Egypt conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, and you know, there you have millions of young people who are going to require quality education. And I think there are two or three elements to that quality education. The first is that they need, on the skills side, to be taught skills that match the business opportunities. In other words, you know, we found this, by the way, a lot in the UK and other developed countries, where you would be giving people training, but it wasn't really geared properly to the world of work. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think it's extremely important in today's world that the education of young people is education for what I would call the open mind, right? In other words, I think the whole point about the way the world works today is that it's connected, it's interdependent, and that means that as a young person, it's important that you learn about other cultures, other peoples, other faiths, and that you're able to navigate your way across those boundaries. So the education, in my view, is not any old education. It should be education towards an open-minded view of the world. And the third thing is, you've got to educate girls equally with boys. This, to me, is absolutely vital. Otherwise, you waste a large proportion of your workforce. So I think, you know, some of what we need to do with education is really fairly obvious. There's one other thing, though, I think is really important, and that is that, you know, I've been very critical of elements of government, but let me say what I think government is indispensable for doing, where you really need government. You see, in a lot of education systems, there isn't a proper way of inspecting and evaluating what is taught. And yet, you know, if you want to learn what's happening to the education of your young people, unless there's some means of analyzing it and investigating it, then you don't really know what is working, what isn't, how schools are performing. For example, there are some countries in which one of the biggest problems is actually getting teachers to turn up and teach. Okay, so if that's your problem, you've got to better deal with that. You've got to have a system that allows you to evaluate it. And the other thing I think that's really important, I used to say this whenever we had debates in cabinet about education. I used to say to all the ministers around the table, right, let's forget for the moment we're the government, and let's just think as parents. You know, forget being politicians, think as parents. What do we as parents want for our children? And if you start from that point of view, what do I want for my child, you're probably likely to get a better answer than if you say, right, I'm a politician analyzing this system. You know, so if you start from that perspective, and that's why the types of things I'm talking about are important, because that's what we want for our children, so that's what we should be putting in our education system.
One of the organizations that you have built since you left office is your Faith Foundation, the Tony Blair Faith Foundation. And you know, you often describe, at that time you described faith as being a very defining feature of not just your life, but in terms of what you think is the biggest challenge going forward, that children should learn the similarities of faith rather than the differences. But do you think, in terms of when you look at your own measures put in place in the UK, take faith schools when you were Prime Minister, do you not believe that they actually lead to greater segregation?
It's a very good question, and it's one I ask myself often, because, you know, faith schools are a big part of the UK system, and yet I think a lot of people like to educate their children in those schools because sometimes they have a stronger ethos, a stronger kind of grounding in values and so on. But I think what I would say is the faith schools only work if they're also integrated into the education system, and it is very important that young people, even if they're taught at a school of a particular faith, are taught about other faiths and are taught in a, what I would say is a constructive way. And, you know, this question of what I call education for the open mind, I think is really, really important now. And it's why, you know, if you do have faith schools, and we do, and they will remain a part of the UK system, you've got to be careful, you know, to ensure that this is done. You know, the way the world works today is, you know, you take, when I was growing up in the northeast of England, you know, everyone was basically white, okay? Right? We had a very small ethnic minority population. I actually remember the day I met my first African, right? I was 12 years old. It was a great, you know, it was a big thing for me because we were brought up in a very homogenous, self-contained community. Everyone was the same. My 14-year-old today, around the table, he will have black, Asian, Far East, as well as, you know, traditional white British. He'll have different faiths, different cultures. That's the way the world is. Now, personally, I like this world. I find it refreshing. But it does mean that in your education of young people, you've got to be educating them. Look, someone may be a Muslim or a Jew or a Hindu, but actually, here's what we share in common, and here's why they are as they are, and this is how they look at you, and this is how you look at, you know, these are really important aspects of education to my mind. So you know, I think, yes, you can have faith schools, but it's important they're still bought into the broader system and the broader values of that system.
Earlier today, we had a session called that focused on the fact that schools are increasingly under attack in places like Peshawar, in places in Afghanistan, in Nigeria. President Obasanjo actually spoke about that at great length. Oh, your friend is here. You know, but there's a question that was posed, which is quite genuine, in that all these youngsters that are being recruited to go fight for ISIS, for example, are recruited in developed economies, or at least in ours, where you have these 3 girls, for example, get on a plane and get to the front line. I mean, what do you have to say about that?
What I have to say about it is that, unfortunately, you know, we're all talking about education in the classroom. But people don't just get educated nowadays in the classroom, right? They're taking influences from all sorts of different quarters, from the internet, from informal education systems. And I think, you know, wherever intolerance is taught, you've got to go out and confront it. And one of the things my foundation is now working on is how you get a global compact on education, where every country accepts its responsibility to ensure their education systems, informal and formal, educate towards religious tolerance and root out religious prejudice. And I think this is really important, because otherwise you've got millions of young people being taught a very narrow view of the world and often a prejudiced view of the world. And that can happen even in a country like ours if, I hope and assume it's not what they're taught in the school, but obviously they're getting those influences from outside the school.
President Kagame, we have a number of representatives of aid agencies in this room and at this conference. You know, the question that I really have to ask is, how sustainable is aid from your experience?
It is as sustainable as the best way you use it. If you use aid to build local capacity on the ground where there are problems, it helps and it works. But if you, by really the political nature of aid, if you are drawn only to emergencies and crises, and that's where you keep spending a lot of this, which in itself is very helpful, because some of these crises need such help. But if we were to approach it in a certain way that, one, we deal with the crises that are there, and I'm not saying the crises are created by those who try to help. So problems will be there. So if we help on that, but on the other hand, look at medium long term in terms of creating or preventing some of the crises or addressing such a problems, and therefore help invest in building capacities on the ground and also empower the situation locally, meaning the people and their systems of governance. Then aid will definitely have a different kind of impact. So it's sustainable. It depends on how you direct it, to what puts you, where you focus, and whether you really insist on building capacity on the ground.
Before I ask my next question, my last question, I should say, to President Kagame, we will open it up to the floor. If you do have a question, please indicate, and I'm sure I have colleagues with microphones here. My only one request is when you do ask a question, you introduce yourselves and which organization you're from. For this session, we are not taking questions from the media, but we will entertain questions from everywhere else, and we'll take 3 questions in a row. So, President Kagame, I was reading about the SDGs and your particular views on them. You think there are too many?
Where we need to focus is, have we learned lessons from the MDGs? And have we carefully thought about this transition from MDGs to SDGs? Therefore, what lessons have we drawn from the previous experiences? And what do we intend to do with the situation as we have known it and as we see it today? So I think I wouldn't so much be bothered as to whether there are too many as to just simply drawing from the previous experiences and lessons and focusing on delivering the results in the new situation. And maybe as we go along with the SDGs, we may learn more lessons, and there should be flexibility to keep adjusting as we go along.
Thank you very much. Any questions?
And I have a similar question now. Why in continental Europe, left is so associated with non-evaluation, more resources, non-teachers evaluation, non-teachers quality, non-rigorous curriculum? What's that? Because I believe my government is more associated with conservative government now in England than with Labour. But I'd love to have you in the parliament as an opposition, because I think we can embrace the same ideas, and why is not that happening?
I think those are 2 fairly chunky questions. Which one would you like to go first?
Well,
there's one particularly for
about going back into Parliament, Mr. Blair?
Well, back into the Portuguese Parliament would be interesting. Challenge, since my Portuguese was not very good. I think those are 2 really good questions, by the way. I mean, on the first, how do you ensure continuity in government? It's a really good question. I mean, look, the best way is the policy is seen to have support and works. I mean, but you need a certain amount of time for that to be clear, and that can be a problem. You see, I think a lot of policy today should be taken out of the left-right debate. A lot of objectives, you still have conservative, progressive, values and positions will still be very important. But the most important test of a policy is, does it succeed? Right? That's, I know this may sound a revolutionary proposition for a politician to put forward, but so the reason why the education reforms we put forward in the UK have at least substantially been carried on by the present Conservative government is in part because I think they were seen to work. Now, I think that the problem always for the left when it's dealing with an education system is very often the left will be closer, for example, to the unions, and some of the unions will be progressive and some will be, let's say, more what I would call actually conservative in the sense they want to preserve the system, so that could be a problem. But, for me, progressive politics in relation to education should be about the finest education you can provide for every child, irrespective of their wealth or background. You know, that is the principle of progressive politics. And what I used to say to people in my own party was there's no greater injustice. If the left stands for removing social injustice, there is no greater injustice than a poor education. And, you know, so if as a result of the way the education system's functioning, it's not working to deliver that good education, then you've got to change it, which is why I always wanted the progressives to be the reformers. But, you know, truthfully, these issues today cross party lines, and I think there's nothing wrong with building a consensus. In fact, I think it's an advantage for a policy if you can build a consensus across the party lines.
President Kagame?
Well, on the question of sustainability, first of all, what we have already seen is education, like many other things. We have come to a level of demand and supply. We have actually raised the demand of education, and we have found that education is necessary for transformation that needs to take place. Therefore, if the demand is high, we need to respond by putting in place what needs to be in place for education to happen and for people to benefit. Now, this is why on the supply side, we talk about the partnership that is necessary between government and the private sector. Evidently, the government also has to play its part, because I mean, for many reasons. One of them, let's say in my particular case, the case of my country, where we started, you know, first of all, there was no government, there was no private sector.
Right.
Until we had, when the government came into being, it had a responsibility to create an environment where has to be there starts coming up, including the growth and continued growth of the private sector and other things. And therefore, based on policy encouraging things to start forming up. So government has its own role. For example, even today in say supporting universities or other institutions for research and other related issues, really government has to play a part. But in creating universities or eventually running them, the private sector can play a very big role. So it is partnership that one would encourage, and once this partnership has clarity and is strong, I think sustainability will be achieved.
Great, thank you. More questions on this side? At the back over there, the gentleman over there. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Faisal Mushtaq. I'm from Pakistan. I'm also sponsoring and building classrooms in my country. Prime Minister Blair, we talk about classrooms, curriculum, critical thinking, and connectivity. More classrooms at the cost of more conflict in the world. When 75 million children are out of school, and each very day we talk about MDGs and SDGs, unless and until we make the world a safer place and not to create more conflict, till the time don't you feel that we will not be able to create the social equity, justice, and that literacy?
Great question.
Thank you.
We'll come to the second. There's a gentleman at the back over there, please.
Thank you. My name is Tendai Mtana. I'm the Minister for Education, the County Government of Mombasa in Kenya. My question is to President Kagame. The subject of dignity in Africa is one that I've heard you passionately speak about. And on the subject of education, I'd like to hear a little bit more from you with regards to how within the learning process, and as we talk about quality, where's the role and what's the future of dignity, particularly for the children that we're raising in this generation? Thank you.
Great question. President Kagame.
Well, the issue of dignity starts almost with everything. It's about empowerment. It's about feeling that even if you have a problem today and may need somebody's help, eventually you should be able to stand on your own feet and fend for yourself. It can't be, and there is no dignity in perpetual dependency or for somebody else's hand until the end of your life. This is where it starts from. So education, therefore, has these two elements that meet the kind of qualification dignity puts forward. One is it empowers you, it gives you the possibility to fit in a society and be able to do what you need to do for yourself. But the other part is maybe we need to integrate education in our education system. This thinking that we are here being educated or we want education to empower ourselves to achieve certain things that many others in other parts of the world have more or less taken for granted, but also to learn that you are very useful to yourself and in a society, and therefore the two work together. You can't just be wanting to have skills, to have education, to get the kind of training, to earn a salary, and so on and so forth. And this is detached from your position in a society, where you stand, what you contribute for your well-being, but also for the well-being of others. I think this is what, and we have built largely on that in our own situation. We go out and talk to our own citizens that today they face a number of problems. We face together a number of problems. But there cannot be anybody else coming to address these problems for us, much as there are people out there willing to come and help, but they help and should help in a manner that enables us, therefore, to be able to tackle our own problems ourselves and stop blaming our problems on somebody else or waiting to have somebody else come and address them. And I think the message is hard, and it is not difficult, because it is hard because everybody has this desire. Anywhere you go, in my country, in other parts of the continent, or the rest of the world, everyone wants to feel that they can do something for themselves, and therefore they can define their own place and space in a society.
Thank you, Mr. Blair. There's a question on Pakistan.
Well, I agree, basically. I mean, look, the presence of conflict is always a massive inhibitor to the presence of education. And a lot of young people get displaced by it. In fact, you can see this indeed in this region of Syria, particularly right now. I think, on the other hand, it's still sensible for us to debate, okay, within the systems, whatever our context, how do we improve education, and how do we ensure that the classrooms and the curriculum and so on give kids the best hope of education. But I also, I do think that the more educated we become as a society and as nations, the better off we are, and therefore the potential for conflict is reduced. But I think it's a statement in the sense that is obviously correct, that where you have large amounts of conflict, you're going to have a reduced opportunity for young people to educate themselves. And some of the most amazing pioneering work in education that is actually done in refugee camps and elsewhere, where the casualties of conflict still manage to get education. But I think nothing should stop us still from working out, well, what are the things that are really working in education, particularly with countries that are in a lesser state of development, and where education is an absolutely vital component of them getting to the next level.
Thank you. Any more questions back here? My friend Esteban, and back there, please.
My name is Esteban Bullrich. I'm the Minister of Education of the city of Buenos Aires. I heard you talking about when you arrived to 10 Downing Street and the troubles you have in changing things. It would be fair to say you achieved some change, even in education. But why do you think it hasn't become a global issue? Why isn't education a global challenge for all leaders? Why is it that the global view comes up when you leave office? And no.
Why is it the
not only you? Not only you. No, but I mean,
why is it what?
The guy that came after you also looks at global education now that he's out of office too. So, no, what I mean to say, in general, leaders seem to look at global education as a challenge when they leave office and not when they are in office. And today, we have a lot of standards. We can really use standards as a tool to impose, for example, improvements in developing countries. Countries like mine. Today, Andrew Schleicher was saying that we could multiply 7 times our GDP just by improving the math knowledge of our kids to a basic level. So why isn't it more of a global issue? And when we come with global goals like the Millennium Goals, they are like vague without using more hard-born data that could help developed countries achieve better results. Why do you think that is the case?
Behind you, there's a question, please.
Thank you. Tom Bennett, Research Ed UK. The question is simply this: what is the role of research playing in policy making in politics for education, and what should the role of research be in policy making in education?
We'll start with President Kagame on that question, please. What is the role of research in decision making?
Well, there is definitely a role of research in decision making, because I'll speak for our own case. We want to formulate policies based on the understanding of the problem and the evidence that if we do certain things, then we will get the results we want. And you can't do that without investing in, therefore, research to understand where we are coming from on any problem and where we should be going, and the different options that would give us the kind of answers we want. So it plays a big role, and particularly in our case, we have invested in that area. We have built capacity to do that. In fact, we have a partnership. Let me say it here, when Honorable Blair is here, he has the Africa Governance Initiative. This initiative works very well for us in Rwanda, because under Africa Governance Initiative, there is a provision of capacities from different parts of the world, where educated people and with a background in not only execution of certain tasks, but also on research, that work with our own people and study situations in our systems, different problems, and say, how do we go about finding a solution? So we want evidence. We want evidence that this problem is what we see it to be, or is what we know it is, and therefore, what is it that would contribute to addressing such a problem? It's very essential. Whether it's the political processes that give rise to certain policies, or anything else, we see that play a part absolutely in decision making.
And I think it's unfair just to ask Mr. Blair the first question, but as a current serving leader of a country,
Right.
do you factor in global thinking when it comes to setting policy? So, for example, like what is being said over here is that do national leaders only care about global education after they leave office?
No, I didn't think it was necessarily correct from the beginning. And I want us to treat global education like any other problem. There are many problems. It's only that we are talking about education today, but we could discuss health another day, or
Sure.
food security another time, and so on and so forth. And of course, leaders in office think about all this. But the first responsibility they are mandated to carry out, the first and not the only one, not exclusively, is how do they deliver on these things in their countries. But how do you deliver in one country alone without drawing whatever resources from other experiences? So we find there is this interaction only in a different way than when, as I have seen it, these leaders have left office, or at some point when I'm not where I am myself. I think there is a freedom for people, to go out there and draw from their experiences for others to benefit, or to use their time really meaningfully, because they are no longer in this space where they are constrained by certain responsibilities that are particular to where they have the mandate.
Yeah, so are you the mayor of Buenos Aires?
I work for him.
Ah, you work for the mayor.
He's
You're
the
not
education minister.
and you stand for election?
Yeah.
Right, in Buenos Aires. Well, try standing for them next time and saying, hey, my priority is those kids in Shanghai. so the reason we do this after we leave is that if I stood in the UK and said, you know what, the UK is too small for me. Really, what I'm interested in, no, that wouldn't have worked. That would have been a one-term premiership. But I mean, truthfully, and joking apart, it's global education. Why can't it be more targeted and specific? Look, I think, right, it is a slightly heretical thing to say. I think there's a limited role for these big development goals. I mean, I think they're important, don't misunderstand me, but in the end, I think we would do more if we were better able to translate the best practices and examples and learning across the world. We would probably do more for individual education systems than simply have, broad development goals, whether in education or anything else. So I'm not against it. And of course, I was in office when we did the Millennium Development Goals, and I think they have had an impact, and they did help to rally people. But I think, you've always got to be careful they don't become so aspirational that really, what difference they make on the ground is fairly limited. And that leads me to the second question, which I think is a very good question. What is the role of research? I think I would say this not just about education policy, but more generally. I think we do need really good quality research from outside of government. But, I found there wasn't a great deal of it around. So, by the way, if you're providing it, that's fantastic, and we should use it. But I think one of the things that's really interesting to me about modern policy making is that whereas when you read the biographies of the politicians, certainly in countries like mine who were growing up in the 20s and 30s and 40s, when a lot of state systems were beginning, there was an intense amount of academic work and learning and research that would translate itself into government policy. And if you think of the great post-war economic framework and the work of Keynes, and he was an academic. But I'm not seeing, and there are examples today, for example, De Soto in the work on land registration as the essential part of development. I think there is really important academic work, but I would say politicians will use it if the quality of that work is really practical. But I used to find too much of the think tankery stuff that I used to get was, it was interesting to stimulate my mental processes, but it didn't allow me to write my next education bill very, very easily. And that's, but I think, my view is policy making is very important intellectual business. It needs to be evidence-based. And I would love it if we had more really good quality research coming out of institutions that allowed policymakers to develop their policy better and more accurately.
So before I ask my next question, the final question, you may have heard of something that we may be organizing a small event for tonight called the Global Teacher Prize ceremony. One of the things that we are asking for is for everyone's support in strengthening the teaching profession and to celebrate classroom achievement. I don't want to call it a lighter note, but on a lighter note, can either of you talk to me about or talk to us about an inspirational teacher that you've had in your upbringing and why they were inspirational?
Well, in my own life, when I was young, as a refugee growing up and studying under a tree. In some places, there were not even trees. We were just directly under the sun. There's a small story. We didn't even have exercise books. We used to write on our thighs. We have to wait until it is dry. Use a piece of dry grass to write numbers, and you take and show the teacher. But there were these teachers. They were not paid, and yet they would go across refugee camps, knocking, at everybody's door and say, "You must send your child to school." And I have seen some of these teachers who taught me in the 60s. They are still there, some of them still doing the same job, and sticking with it and making sure that these young people are educated. Others have since, moved to other places. Actually, some of them working in our own government systems at different levels. But these were selfless people, who did everything that was very difficult at the time, and insisting on it, on doing it. So you see this kind of person, you really understand there was a sense of mission for the better of others more than for himself. And I have had a number of them in my life.
President Kagame, I'm looking for a name.
Oh, he's called Agustin. One of them is Agustin Nyabusisi, who was a teacher of mine in primary school. And he's still a teacher today. He taught me in primary school in the late 60s. And he's still teaching. He has now moved up teaching a secondary school with some of our people actually who were refugees at the time and have returned to the country, and where they have settled, he has stayed with them and is still teaching them.
Mr. Blair, one teacher from your path.
Right. What a wonderful story, actually, of President Kagame's. And I can't say I had an educational background, anything as difficult as how he learned.
Well, the northeast of England is a bit rough. As a Londoner.
Not the bit that I came from. But, and actually, by the way, one fascinating story about your prize. I was up the other morning in London, looking at the television, and I'd come in halfway through a little story that they're running, and it's something about a $1 million education prize. And literally, even though I know all about, because you told me about it, I'm thinking, who on earth's done that? And up comes this guy from just outside my constituency. I think from Teesside or somewhere.
Middlesbrough.
Middlesbrough, right? He's a dancing biology teacher, which I'm...
Is he here in the room?
Right.
No.
Anyway, I'm looking forward to that. No, I'd actually, a teacher that you know is someone called Eric Anderson, who was my English teacher, and he was the first person that really gave me a love for reading and for studying the English language as opposed to just speaking it. And he introduced me to Sir Walter Scott, the novelist, who nowadays would be very out of fashion with everybody. But he managed to make it exciting for me. And I think the great thing about education is how it, when a young person's mind is in that formative stage, where they can be enthused and enlightened, and where suddenly their horizons expand. And the reason why I've always been so passionate about education is that I know I was very lucky. I had a really good education. I mean, nothing like the president's. And I know without that, I could never have dreamt what I could do. I would never have been aware of what I could do. And I think the most fascinating thing you ever come across in education is when you see that young person's mind develop and they suddenly know and feel the confidence within themselves as to what they can achieve. And that's just a wonderful thing. And it's why teaching is not just a profession, it's a vocation in the end. And everyone will have their story about a teacher that's made a difference to them. Sure. And certainly, I could never have done any of the things I did in my life without having people who were prepared to inspire me and get me to learn.
Additionally, if I may say, this same teacher would teach me geography, teaches me mathematics, teaches me history. The job.
All with a bit of grass. The knee must have got a bit worn after a time.
So that is.
Thank you both very much. It's been a fascinating conversation.